Okay.
And if I do some stills, it's okay to post on social media?
Sure.
Probably just Instagram. And so you're going to start by introducing yourself, because also keep in mind that, you know, we're doing a very short video, but we're going to upload the full length to our webpage.
Okay.
So that people who are really interested and want the full-on experience will be able to see this whole interview.
Okay.
So start with introducing yourself,
Okay.
please.
Anim bojo. Ojawa nang kwen edishnakas my ganadodam obajawa nadonjaba. Hello, my name is Teddy Syrette. My Anishinaabe name is Yellow Star Woman. I sit in the Wolf Clan, and I'm originally from Batchewana First Nation, grew up on Rankin Reserve, and now live in Toronto.
Great.
I hear a plane. It's like going away though. Like just about done.
So that's okay
Okay.
for the introduction.
Okay. I think it's gone now.
So can you talk a little bit about the type of work that you do? I know you do a lot of workshops and a lot of educational work.
So the type of work that I do is surrounding building awareness and conversations around Two-Spirit, queer, trans, Indigenous identities throughout Turtle Island, using storytelling as a method to create those conversations when it comes to creating inclusive spaces and more educational practices for Two-Spirit, queer, trans, Indigenous people.
Cool. And since you brought up some terminology, can you maybe talk a little bit about the meaning of those terms, like Two-Spirit?
So the term Two-Spirit, is, to my understanding, is a very modern term that was created by Indigenous people for Indigenous people who identify as being under the LGBTQ or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer spectrum. That is inclusive of gender diversity, non-binary identities, gender fluidity, and it can also be inclusive to sexual identities as well. But specifically for Indigenous people who are identified as being First Nations, Métis, Native American, what have you. So Indigenous people of Turtle Island or North America.
And what do things like gender fluid mean and non-binary?
The terms like gender fluidity and non-binary have very different meanings for a lot of Indigenous First Nations people, depending on where they're coming from, what nation they're from, what traditions and ceremonies that their communities have for those folks. But they're necessarily for folks who don't necessarily self-identify as being male and or female or man and woman. It could be a combination of both. It could be a flexibility or fluidity between maleness and femaleness, depending on how they self-identify or their self-expression. Besides just what their assigned sex at birth might be. So understanding that gender and sexuality is more complex than what we think of colonial senses of gender when it comes to just man or just woman. Because in many different First Nations communities and Indigenous communities, that's not the case. And that's familiar for different cases, for different cultures right across the world. When you're looking at gender diversity or sexual expression, and that inclusivity in those cultures, and also looking at the complexities of when there's colonization on top, all that also play a role. So when it comes to non-binary and gender fluidity, you can take those like contextual definitions for them, but they'll have a different meaning depending on where you're going across Turtle Island. Geese.
There's too many trees.
It's a sign.
So yeah, you talked about how that is impacted, of course, by colonization. Like, can you talk a little bit about the role of, like, the way Two-Spirit people might have been members of pre-colonization, like before the impact of colonization? What was it like to be Two-Spirit? I know they're in all that diversity around, but are there any commonalities?
I think in a sense where like depending on where you go, there are different definitions in different languages for two-spirited terms before the modern sense of two-spirit ever existed. Um, and in some communities, it wasn't ever really based even to like on someone's gender or their sexuality or who they chose as a partner. But sometimes it depended more on their gifts and what their community roles were in that community. So if they were a better hunter or a better fire keeper, or if they're a medicine person, or if they picked medicines, or if they did basket weaving, it all depended on what their gifts were given to them by Creator and creation. So that's an understanding that I've received in my community, in my territory up near Batchewana. But it is going to be very complex and different for everybody, because there's still people who might not have those teachings, where they don't have any kind of terminology or traditional ceremonies for their two-spirited folks. But in other cases, they might have different terminology.
Okay, I think I'm gonna ask to change the framing a bit to go in tighter.
Okay.
So we see more of, yeah, we're closer shot. Yeah. You want to stick with the sunglasses, right?
I can take them off if you prefer them.
Yeah, I think that would be more expressive. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the experience of two-spirit trans people in today's society, and if you can talk a little bit about the harms that they experience by virtue of being who they are.
I think some of the harms that two-spirit and specifically trans and gender fluid people that face in a modern society is a generally lack of awareness about gender and sexuality as a whole, but also the complexities of being Indigenous and what does it mean to be living in a colonized state that has perpetuated aspects of discrimination for like homophobia and transphobia towards multiple LGBTQ people. But looking at the barriers and how complex it is might be of just being Indigenous and the challenges that they face, such as high rates of criminalization, high rates of violence, issues with housing, educational, and healthcare. It can be very complexities if someone's entering those spaces to try to seek services in a modern sense, when the people who are providing those services have no awareness whatsoever of how to properly engage with somebody who is identified as being First Nation or Indigenous, and on top of that, somebody who might identify as being Two-Spirit or LGBTQ. So I think there's still a lack of that awareness that creates multiple other barriers where people don't necessarily want to know. Or there could be a case of like that bystander effect where they're just not too sure how to engage with somebody and instead just decide not to engage whatsoever and hope somebody else will take care of it, which can create even more dangers for Two-Spirit, queer, trans, Indigenous people who are trying to access those services. It might face even greater burdens or greater challenges when accessing services like healthcare or employment or social services.
Can you talk a little bit about homophobia and transphobia and like the rates of violence, interpersonal violence that folks experience?
Yeah, I think when it comes to homophobia and transphobia and Indigenous two-spirited people, it's very there's multiple different levels, because there's the one, again, those challenges of just being Indigenous that they face in society, but it could also be additional pressures onto them if they're racialized. And also identifying as being queer and trans. So I think there's like historically, those values of homophobia and transphobia were not necessarily Indigenous values or First Nations values. They're necessarily not the values that I've learned of like understanding of like loving and respecting everybody, and that everybody has a purpose and that everybody has a role within creation. It doesn't matter how different you are. We still need each other to have that sense of balance. We still need each other to have our circles and communities stronger together. So when it comes to those history and looking at the research that has been done about homophobia and transphobia on Indigenous people, it's very systemic and it is very historic, where you had like early two-spirited people who were met with initial violence. Sometimes we're the first societies that were erased from Indigenous cultures and societies. So even trying to find those terminologies where people who are trying to find access or trying to engage with Indigenous people without that terminology is really hard, because we know that language is very important for Indigenous people. We know that language is very ceremonial for a lot of First Nations Indigenous people. And without that language or without that terminology, sometimes it could be harder for people to connect just to find that connection, to build those supports for Two-Spirited Queer Trans Indigenous people, if they don't have Two-Spirit or Queer Trans Indigenous terminology that's of their own. However, with like history that has been done and research being done, like with Harlan Pruden, with their research has found like there's been multiple terminologies for multiple centuries and generations in different communities across North America that have that terminology, and it's growing because there's definitely a need for it, because we see a push for finding those supports and finding those better tools and resources for Two-Spirited Queer Trans Indigenous people because of those high rates of violence that they face and the high rates of mental illness, housing issues that they have, and aspects of suicide and suicide ideation. Two-Spirited people are impacted by that greatly, because we know that Indigenous people are impacted by those factors, and we know that LGBTQ people are impacted by those factors. We just don't know how many Indigenous people are being impacted, because sometimes we're still not having those conversations with people who don't want to engage, or if they don't know how to engage at all.
So what happens when folks experience violence, either at the hands of a stranger or maybe in an intimate relationship, and they need assistance? What kind of experiences do they have when they seek supports and services?
I think if somebody is facing different aspects of violence, or if they're whether that's be personal relationships, or if they're accessing services or accessing care and being faced with discrimination, whether it be with racism or tied with their gender or their sexuality, it can be very isolating for them if they don't have enough resources or supports to reach out and share their stories and to share their truth with what's happening to them. I think it was also with that lack of awareness initially, there might be service providers who don't know how to, again, engage in those stories, or to take the information that's being shared to them as valid evidence of being abuse or violence. Because again, those systemic barriers when it comes to gender or sexuality or race. So I think for some people, if they're going to, for instance, if they're trying to access like a healthcare provider, and they know that the receptionist or the nurse there is like holds those values of homophobia and transphobia or racism or both, or all of that, it might not initially be a safe place for them to, one, be an Indigenous person accessing that care, or one, being a Two-Spirit or Queer Trans Indigenous person accessing that care. So one of the results could be is like they either trying to find those supports elsewhere, or do they just go out without that service, which can create more issues later on the line, especially if it comes to aspects of like social wellness or mental health or healthcare. And so that's very disturbing when we know that there's people with my community where if they're going to a hospital, if they're going to an appointment, it's important for me to reach out to them and even ask them, like, do they have a friend going with them? Do they have somebody that can be there along themselves to advocate for them in case they're faced with those kind of barriers that I had mentioned before? So again, it could be very isolating. It could be very detrimental to their health and their well-being. And which is really hard for everybody in the community, because if one person's suffering, then the rest of the community suffers, because we're only as strong as our weakest link. So we need to make sure that those people who are facing multiple barriers within their life or whatever they're experiencing, we also have to hold space for them and making sure that their truths are also being honored.
What are some concrete things that they encounter that are negative, that they experience as harmful, to make them not want to go back to certain agencies?
I think a lack of acknowledgement when it comes to gender inclusive language. So there are still could be an initial barrier when you walk into a service provider and be met with like hello ma'am or hello sir, if you identify as gender fluid or Two-Spirit or non-binary, and those identifiers don't match with your own experience. So like avoiding that kind of language, moving past those gender norms when it comes to language, but also spaces within itself. So for somebody who identifies identifies as being gender fluid and two-spirit myself, the one thing I always try to look for is like gender-inclusive bathrooms, or like unisex bathrooms, or whatever that might be, because then I know for me that okay, there is a space for me there because they have carved out space for people who might have that same experience. But if you don't have that experience, and that's the question, is like, okay, then where do I go to the washroom? If I do this, go to this washroom, is it going to be safe? Another barriers that other people can face from the aspects right from the get-go is like forms, so like intake forms. So when people are looking at like gender and sex, or like they're using gender and sex as being the same, when that's not necessarily inclusive for somebody else's own experience or how they self-identify. So if you have those forms, your intake forms that say either male and female, and like nothing else, then that can be a barrier right there when someone doesn't identify as being male and or female. For myself, if I find myself with one of those forms, I just end up drawing a little box and then putting my own identity marker there. Just because it's just it's something that's a good practice for me. So if I go to a form and there's another box or another place for me to self-identify, then that creates space for myself to hopefully have that better experience. I think the other big important too is just pronouns. So like these are just like very basic things that people can work on, but just understanding that pronouns might be very different for everybody, and we can't assume somebody else's experience is going to be similar, or we can't read somebody and how they self-identify by just meeting them once or twice. So it's a matter of like even just like asking those questions of like or like even doing it with your own practice. It's like, my name is, my pronouns are, which is this really good practice for themselves as a service provider or as a helper within that community. And if I hear that cue, so if I hear somebody come up to me and say, my name is, my pronouns are, then for me automatically I think that person probably has had a workshop before, they probably have had training, they probably have somebody within their life or their clients or their family who self-identifies and uses pronouns. So for me, it's a cue, right? So it's an audio cue for me to hear like, okay, this place is a little bit safer. If I don't hear it, then it's something for me to be aware of and maybe to ask questions later on, if I'm comfortable enough or if I'm brave enough to ask those questions. Because sometimes you don't have that time, especially if it's an emergency. When you just need to figure out what the problem is right at the get-go, and you might not have time to advocate for another box on their form. So, but again, if it's just that practice of general awareness, then it can be a lot easier for everybody to access those spaces and have a good experience, and make them feel like more welcomed within the community, and make sure, and like reaching out and telling other people within their own families or in their own communities, like, hey, you should go to this place because they have really good employment officers that use pronouns, or you should go to this agency because they have done training and there is inclusive washrooms there that you can use. And so I think that's the kind of what we're trying to aim for when we're trying to create those spaces for two-spirit, queer, trans people and people who identify as non-binary or gender fluid.
How about if we were now thinking of turning our minds specifically to Indigenous agencies or community settings like ceremony? What are some messages that you would convey to those spaces that may not have been very friendly or safe for two-spirit trans people?
I think when it comes to Indigenous agencies or Indigenous groups or gatherings that happen when it comes to when it's inclusive of traditions or ceremonies, that there needs to be again, more conversations happening about gender and sexuality, just like basic commonalities and basic understandings of what gender and what sexuality is. And I think we have to also, when we're looking back, that we have to look at the history too of sexual violence towards Indigenous people when it comes to the different abuses that they might have faced during residential schools or the 60s scoop or whatever kind of other colonial traumas that might have occurred, and even specifically with the report of murdered and missing Indigenous Indigenous women, where you saw a whole section within there, and like how people can have like better supports and create those inclusive spaces and create inclusive policies and procedures and standards for engaging with 2S LGBTQ. I think that's how they worded it in their report, and that was something that we could use as a base, because within other aspects of like other calls of action, sometimes Two-Spirit identity is forgotten. When you saw the 94 calls to action released with the TRC report, it was very little or very little information about Two-Spirit or queer trans Indigenous identity, which was very concerning, because understanding that queer and trans identity, or the term Two-Spirit, is very modern, but the concept and like the people who identified as being queer and trans throughout history, who are Indigenous, also attended residential schools, because these are some people, it's like, because I've met family members of Two-Spirit people who went to those schools, and Two-Spirited people who came out, who have come out to me identifying as being Two-Spirit or LGBTQ, who are elders and seniors who went to those spaces. And their experiences were very different, and some of those experiences were very violent. So I think it's another thing too of like debunking what is the difference between sexual violence towards Indigenous people and what is like sexual identity and what is just like common attraction or gender fluidity, because that is not what that violence was. Like this was like something that was either honored or something that was respected or something that was a part of their communities. From a very long period of time, and that colonial violence was something that kind of like masked that. So I think there's a lot of people who are within those agencies who look down at LGBTQ people because it makes them maybe even reflect about the abuses that happened before, and understanding that it is like historical trauma that we all need to go through as a community to talk more about and to move and move forward within a good way, and understanding that we all have to heal on both fronts. But I think for folks who are resistant to being inclusive towards Two-Spirit or queer trans Indigenous people because it might go against their own teachings or their own traditions or their ceremonies, how they've done it for multiple years, can be really hard for them to open up and try to build those spaces. For somebody who identifies as being gender fluid, it's very important for myself and for other folks to find those spaces that are going to be inclusive of our identities, who are going to use pronouns, who are going to allow us to sit wherever we feel like we need to sit on whatever side, and maybe even removing those gendered ways of teachings. Not saying that there's anything wrong with them, but I'm just saying that sometimes it can be very closed off for people who are trying to access those services when they feel like they need to conform to something that they're not, such as like wearing skirts or not wearing skirts, because that is like something that is also very that create multiple barriers and multiple discussions when people are trying to access those ceremonies, if they're looking for that wellness and care for their spiritual identity, and folks who are trying to provide that spiritual care and that spirit work. So there's still multiple conversations that need to happen, but we really need to challenge those leaders, I think, because the barriers are real. There are still people who are still continually met with a lot of violence and met with a lot of experiences that nobody would ever even think about that someone would go through, only because of how they identify as being Two-Spirit.
And what kind of an impact can that have on someone if they can't access ceremony?
Well, if they can't access ceremony and that support, then I feel like there's a part of them that goes missing. Where my teachings are, we have like the medicine wheel, and the medicine wheel teaching is like the embodiment of health and wellness when it comes to our mental, our emotional, our physical, and our spiritual needs. So if a part of our spiritual needs aren't being met, then there's a strain on all of our other systems, and we have to compromise. And I think it puts a lot of barriers and distance in those Indigenous people who might experience that kind of discrimination within ceremonies or traditional settings. And my question is, if they can't get access to their ceremonies or their ability to prayer, then whose prayers and whose ceremonies do they pick up along the way? Or how long will it take them to actually come back and pick up those ceremonies? Or do they ever pick up those ceremonies at all? Because you have a lot of different Two-Spirit and queer trans Indigenous people who have totally not want to go back because of safety, because of those protocols, because of those aspects where they don't feel welcomed at all. And there are some people who are starting to like build those spaces, but I think it's like almost an act of like tolerance, where they're just tolerating two-spirited people if a two-spirited person self-identifies, but it's not laid out specifically when for every ceremony or community. But if that's just how they pray, and if they're not inclusive to that, then it's always a matter of like trying to find other ceremonies that are inclusive, because there are different ceremonies and lodges who are starting to change their mindset and to be more inclusive and moving past tolerance and more acceptance within their circles.
Is there anything that I missed that either of you can think of? We should be covering? Yeah, my notes here. You did a really good job of talking about services and what is a barrier and what can be more helpful. Anything that you would want to add?
No, I think it's just like when it comes to like another like barrier that two-spirited people can face too is like when they're accessing services that are like indigenous based, but that if they're not inclusive to that, then they might just have to hide themselves. So again, it's a matter of two, is like, is it safe for me to come out as being gay within these spaces, even though this is the only resource that I have when I'm trying to access those kinds of supports and care. So I think that's another thing too, that it's also a huge pressure that people need to face when they have to either come out and like weigh those options, like, is it safe for me to be my full self in this space, or is it not, or do I just have to put myself back in the closet, which is really hard to do, because according to like Lorraine Blue Waters, there's no closets in teepees, and there's no closets in wigwams. So why should we have to hide ourselves when we're trying to access ourselves within those spaces?
I have one thing I want to do, so just look at the
Yeah.
camera. Okay.
Yeah,